Hi, and welcome back to another AnyRPG Development Livestream. In these videos, you can watch the live development of the AnyRPG Engine, a free and open source role-playing game engine designed in Unity and written in C#. If you don't already have a copy of AnyRPG, you can pick one up from anyrpg.org/downloads in both Unity package and source code format. You can also find a downloadable playable version of A Lost Soul, the free game that I work on in these episodes. In today's episode, we will be making some performance enhancements to the event system for the game, and I've been going through and just fixing some minor issues that I noticed in order to try to improve performance in the game. And over the last little while, I fixed an issue where the character would go into T-pose whenever you swapped out weapons, and then an issue where the character would lose the proper jump animation whenever you equipped a weapon as well. And there's one final issue that I noticed here when you equip a weapon, and I'm just going to demonstrate that now real quickly. And so if we're running around, everything is fine, and if we run around and take off a shield and put a shield back on, it's fine. There's nothing really happening there, and everything looks okay. And then if we're running around and we equip a weapon, I don't know if you noticed it, but there was a bit of a pause there. The entire game paused and the character actually paused. So the shields are fine, but the weapons are not. And there's a good reason for this. It has to do with the way that the event system in the game is working. And what happens is the event system is sending out tons of notifications that it doesn't need to be sending out when that weapon switch is happening. So let's just enable this debug here. These are prerequisite conditions, and where is met basically checks if a prerequisite is met. And this is how we're sending events between objects and letting things know that they can spawn and despawn, or that quests can be complete, is all through this whole prerequisite system. But there's a problem with it, and that was when it was originally built, there was like one object in the scene and one type of prerequisite, and so it was kind of okay to just have this concept of like a generic prerequisite to subscribe to. However, now you can see that even on character load, I had like over 1,000 prerequisite checks. And let's just clear this here, and let's run around and put on the weapon. You'll notice there's a substantial pause here, far longer, and that's because each of those debug messages that's printing out results in a stack trace, and those stack traces are really impacting performance. But once again, there was over 1,000 notifications and prerequisites that were checked just as a result of that weapon being equipped. And so that's largely what's probably responsible for that big pause when we put the weapon on. So to do that, we'll have to basically change the way that these things are managed. And in the system event manager, we're sending notifications, and being kind of lazy, I just had everything subscribed to on prerequisites updated. And so what we need to do is change the code so that this kind of stuff is subscribing to exactly the event and only the event that it needs to. So what we want to do here is, for every prerequisite in the prerequisite conditions, we've got level prerequisites, character class prerequisites, etc. We want to have each of these prerequisites subscribe individually to the events that they want. Another problem is that our interactable class, which is based on our spawnable class here, if we go to the definition of that, what it's doing is it is subscribing to a system manager generic prerequisite update event, and then going through and checking every single prerequisite, basically. And those checks are all live. So we want to swap the way that prerequisite checks are done. Prerequisites basically shouldn't be checked live. They should individually subscribe to events, and then after that they should individually basically check those things, and not have the main object subscribing to events and then checking every prerequisite whether or not it's met. And that should hopefully reduce the number of prerequisite checks from 1,000 down to like maybe 2 or 3 when we equip the sword, hopefully, and that should hopefully get rid of that big pause. So what we need to do is we'll just start with the first prerequisite condition, go to the level prerequisite, and this prerequisite has an isMet method that basically is a live query of the character's level. So what we want to do is we want to change this. We basically want to just keep track of whether or not this prerequisite is met. So we'll need a new private bool prerequisite met, and we'll make it false by default. Then what we want to do is we'll need a new method here to check if this prerequisite is met, and then set it to true. And then isMet here is basically just going to return prerequisite met. And what we want to do then is let's see. This one we might actually be okay on a live check on this one, because this one is actually not subscribing to anything. Although, yeah, let's actually get it to subscribe to something just to be consistent. So we'll need to make a public void, and this will be a method that we'll use to get notified of when this prerequisites requirement is updated. So we should call this something useful then. Let's just call it requirement updated. And requirement updated will need to accept the base character, and we're basically just going to take all this code right here, move it over, and this is the only case in which it's true. So what we would do here is we would do prerequisite met equals true. And then we can just return. In both of these cases, we just return without setting it. And in the last case, we don't even have to return anything because it's just a void anyway. And then for isMet, we are just going to directly return prerequisite met. And what we want to do is, for requirement updated, we want to subscribe to events that basically whenever the character gets its level updated. So we have a notify on level changed. And that looks like about the best place to put it. Let's go to the definition of that and see if anyone's subscribed to it. Good, lots of people are subscribed to it. Okay, so this thing is in use then. And we're calling it right here on gain level. So in our setup scriptable objects then, which is the call that's made for every prerequisite in order to initialize it, we will want to basically create some subscriptions to that event. And in this case, on level changed has an int with new level in it. So let's eliminate on prerequisites updated because that call is now redundant. And for the level prerequisite here, we don't even need the base character. We can just have int new level. And here we can pretty much just get, actually, let's see, no, we want to switch this up for player manager.myInstance.myCharacter. And then same thing, player manager.myInstance.myCharacter.myCharacterStats and player manager.myInstance.myCharacter stats Okay, that's good. So then next we want to actually subscribe to that event. So system event manager.myInstance.on level changed plus equals And you know what? We can even, I think I'm just going to simplify the way that this method works and comment this code out right here. And here we're just going to compare new level against required level. And we don't even need the return because we're just setting prerequisites met. All right, and now in order to keep consistent, I'm actually going to make a public void handle level changed. And have the int new level. And we're just going to call requirement updated and then pass new level to it. Then we can subscribe with handle level changed. We'll also need a way to remove the subscription, so public void cleanup scriptable objects. And a lot of times this might happen when the game is closing and the system event manager may not exist. So if it does not equal null, then we are going to unsubscribe from that. Now, if the prerequisite is met, what we want to do is basically call back to the prerequisite condition set that initialized us and let it know that the prerequisite is met now. And for the prerequisite condition, we should actually do the same thing, and if it's met, we should pretty much do a callback to whatever actually uses these prerequisite conditions and let it know that the conditions are met. And that it can do whatever it needs to do. So what we'll want to do is keep a reference to some prerequisite conditions. So we'll make a prerequisite conditions called prerequisite conditions. And when we set up our scriptable objects, we'll want to accept the prerequisite conditions object. So we will accept a prerequisite conditions prerequisite conditions. And then we will set this dot prerequisite conditions equals prerequisite conditions. Then we'll make a callback right here and let it know that it needs to perform the prerequisite check. And we'll need to actually go into the interface to the iPrerequisite and let it know that this accepts a parameter now. So if our prerequisite conditions does not equal null, then prerequisite conditions dot and we'll just, let's see, make that same call requirement updated. Then we'll have to add this requirement updated method in the prerequisite conditions, which will basically just do an isMet call. And let's see, we just want to check if is met. And then we're now going to do a callback to the owning object of these prerequisite conditions. So to do that, we want to basically find all references to the prerequisite conditions. And see who's using them. So it looks like interactable option is using them. So at some point we make a setup scriptable objects call on those prerequisite conditions. And we'll just want to pass in this. And since multiple things can use prerequisite conditions, we need a common interface for everything that's going to use prerequisite conditions so that we have a common method that we can call back with, basically. So let's see here. On the interactable option, we check if my prerequisite is met, I believe, from the interactable. Let's find all references to that. This code is called, let's see, when basically deciding whether or not we, I think, can display things. Let's find all references to the valid interactables and get valid interactables, which is done for things like instantiating the minimap indicator. And instantiating the minimap indicator is called from a handle prerequisite updates. So I think what we'll do here is we will keep this method handle prerequisite updates, but we'll basically call it from the interactable options within the interactable rather than from the system event manager, because we still have a need for the way that this function is basically calling down and checking things in order to see like if it can instantiate its minimap indicator. So I like the name handle prerequisite updates. So what we want to do is basically go sort of back down this stack here down to the interactable option. So the interactable option has a handle prerequisite updates call already. So I think we'll make an iPrerequisite owner interface that just has this handle prerequisite updates method in it, so that any prerequisite condition can call back to its owner, which can then figure out what to do with that. So, and to do that, let's look for the iInteractable class, which is, I think I have a bunch of interfaces in here. I do iInteractable. Okay, I'm just going to Control D to duplicate this iInteractable interface, and we're going to call this new one iPrerequisite owner. And need to change that to iPrerequisite owner. It's not inheriting off of anything, and the only thing it has is a single void handle prerequisite updates. So then interactable option needs to inherit from iPrerequisite, or I mean to implement iPrerequisite owner, which it basically already does. So now when we pass the this object into setup scriptable objects, we can go to the definition of setup scriptable objects on prerequisite conditions, and we can accept an iPrerequisite owner, prerequisite owner. And we'll then want to keep a reference to that, so private right, I got two I's on that. Prerequisite owner, prerequisite owner, and then here we'll just want to set that. So we will set this dot prerequisite owner equals prerequisite owner. And then since the method that we're calling is handle prerequisite updates, let's just keep the naming consistent here, and instead of being requirement updated, it'll be handle prerequisite updates. So the level prerequisite we'll call handle prerequisite updates. And if is met, then we also want to check and prerequisite owner does not equal null, then we want to call our prerequisite owner dot handle prerequisite updates. Okay, and I think this is the architecture that we will stick with. So then we actually want to go back into the prerequisite owner, which in this case is the interactable option, and in its handle prerequisite updates, we basically want to call back to the interactable, because the interactable now needs to check if it's able to instantiate like a minimap indicator or whatnot for this thing. So basically, if interactable isn't null, then we will call interactable.handle prerequisite updates. Okay, good. So now we just need to do that for all of the other prerequisite types of conditions. So we'll go to prerequisite conditions. We've got level prerequisite done. Now we need to go for character class prerequisite as well. So we'll open up character class prerequisite. And then copy over the code that we put in level prerequisite. So we need to have a reference to the prerequisite conditions. So that we can perform the callback. We want to have a bool that checks if it's met. We want to have a handle something event. And let's see. Let's check the system event manager and see if we have a class changed event. If we don't, we will want to make one then. It doesn't look like we do. So I believe that's going to happen in characters. Let's see, it might be its character class. Okay, it's right here in base character. So if we go to the definition of character class, find all references to that. And we actually call an onClass change. So in this case, we're not sending this out through the system event manager. It's being subscribed to directly through the base character. So what I want to do is actually basically move that over to the system event manager. And then find all references to that and see who's subscribing to it. Oh, you know what? No, actually there's a reason why that's being called locally. It's being called locally because the player equipment manager actually has to subscribe to that as well. So we actually want to leave that event notification. We're just going to send a secondary one to anything that's listening globally for these messages. So what we'll do then is we'll make another one of these notify events. So public void notify on class change. And it's new character class, old character class. And then we just call on class change. With new character class, old character class. And this is in base character, so what we actually want to do is we actually want to call that in player character. So we're going to go for base character, go to implementation, find player character, and just see so it's calling base.setCharacterClass. And we need to basically just keep track of that old character class. And then we want to send out the system event manager dot system event manager dot my try that again, system event manager dot my instance dot notify on class change, sending out the new character class and the old character class. Alright, so now we actually have something to subscribe to. So in the setup scriptable objects method, we're going to do basically what we did right here. We will need to accept prerequisite conditions. And we will need to set this prerequisite conditions and then subscribe to that stuff. And then actually we should do the cleanup scriptable objects call as well. And in this case, it's not handle level changed. It's going to be handle class change with character class new character class and character class old character class. And all we need to do here is just return prerequisite met. We don't need to do any of that code anymore. And here, we're just going to basically do if let's see, player manager.myInstance.my character.my character class equals new character class, then prerequisite met is true. And this is going to be on class change equals handle class change. Okay, so now we can subscribe to it, and then if the prerequisite conditions does not equal null, then we want to let the prerequisite conditions perform an update. And actually, we want to do that all the time. And here we want to set a prerequisite met equals false because it's possible we could perform a character class change which sets the prerequisite to false. So we'll want to remove that and do the same thing here. We can get rid of all that code right there. And in fact, we can even get rid of requirement updated. Just to keep things simple, we put that inside the handle level changed. Okay, that should be good. Then the next thing that we want to do is go on to the next prerequisite. Which is trade skill prerequisite. We'll open that up. Copy in these two variables here. we'll want to add a handle skill change method. And we'll want to adjust the setup scriptable objects method to accept a prerequisite condition. And then let's see what kind of system events, if any, we have for handle skill change. We do have an on skill list changed. You can't really unlearn skills at this point. We'll remove the on prerequisites updated call from there, and we'll just see who's notifying on skill list changed. This is in learn skill. So when we learn a skill, we learn all the abilities associated with that skill and then notify on the skill list changed. So that's fine. We have skill, new skill. So for trade skill prerequisite, we can just accept the skill, new skill, and if the new skill is equal to the prerequisite skill, then our prerequisite is met. Otherwise it's false, and I think I need to fix that here as well, and likely there, because no, it's the good there. Okay. Then here we can just simply return prerequisite met. This will be on skill list changed, and this will be handle skill list changed. Okay, that's good for trade skill prerequisites, I think. Next we want to do ability prerequisites. So let's go to the definition of those. And add the same code. So add the prerequisite conditions as well as the isMet flag. We'll want to add a handle, probably ability list changed or something like that. Then in the setup scriptable objects call, we'll want to add this code as well as the new cleanup scriptable objects method. And we will want to accept prerequisite condition. Okay, so now we want to see what kind of system events hopefully we have for ability list changed. This is the notify on ability list changed. We have new ability. So we'll get rid of the generic on prerequisites updated there. And we will just subscribe to notify on ability list changed. So this will be called handle ability list changed. We will be accepting a base ability, new ability, and if the new ability equals the prerequisite ability, then it's met is true. Now, in this case, we don't actually want to set the prerequisites met to false. And in fact, honestly, even with the trade skill, we don't really want to either. With the ability and trade skill prerequisites, we only really care that they're set to true because you've learned it once. If you unlearn it after that, it's not going to be a big deal. For the character class, we do care. We really only do want this to be true if the character is currently that class. And since you can't de-level, then there isn't really any point in resetting the level prerequisite met to false either. So then here we can just get rid of all that code and just return prerequisite met. Here we'll be subscribing with handle ability list changed, and this should say on ability list changed is the event that we're subscribing to. I think that's good for ability prerequisites. Next we have quest prerequisites. We will want to do the same thing here. So we'll set the prerequisite condition, and if the prerequisite is met, let's see, now in this case, the event I think that we want to subscribe to is basically quest status updated. But I don't think that this is something that we want to do through the System Event Manager. Because if we do it through the System Event Manager, we will get this notification every single time any quest in the game is updated. So I think we should actually just subscribe to the individual quest, because otherwise we will receive far too many notifications. So we'll continue with the setup scriptable objects like normal here. And we'll add this code, but then we're going to modify it a little bit to not subscribe to the System Event Manager, but to actually subscribe to the quest itself. So let's go to the quest, because I believe we actually do emit an event already. So we emit a notify on quest status updated when we turn the quest in. When we remove it from our log, and when we mark it complete, as well as when we accept it. So this is perfect. What we'll need to do is we'll just need to create our own event inside of the quest and emit the event directly rather than sending this out to the System Event Manager. Okay, so to do that, we'll actually want to make an event to emit. So we'll just copy this on quest status updated here. We'll move it in. And everywhere where we do this, we basically just want to do on quest status updated. So right there where we remove the quest, right here where we mark it complete, and finally right here where we accept it. Now, the notify on quest status updated Let's go to the definition of that. We can pretty much get rid of this onPrerequisitesUpdated method, I think. Now let's go to the definition of onAfterQuestStatusUpdated, because I remember there was a good reason why I added that. And this is in the Quest Tracker UI. I think I'm just going to leave the System Event Manager version of this. For the Quest Tracker UI, it's kind of okay. We're okay with receiving events whenever any particular quest is updated because it's tracking a bunch of quests. So for now, I think that's fine. So we'll continue to emit those messages. However, we will not emit onPrerequisitesUpdated. And in the quest prerequisite, we actually want to subscribe to the quests on QuestStatusUpdated. And the quest is actually the prerequisite quest. So prerequisite quest.on QuestStatusUpdated plus equals, and now we need a method to handle the quest status update. So we'll call it handle quest status updated. And it doesn't need to accept a parameter because it's specific to the quest that we're subscribing to. And then we're basically going to copy all this code here. And let's see. Here we don't need to do anything. Here we're going to set prerequisite met equals true. Same thing there. Same thing there. And then let's see here, I think these need to be else ifs. And then this needs to be an else. All right, that looks good. Then here we can just remove all that code and return prerequisite met. Okay, that should work. Now we want to do dialog prerequisites. So we'll go to the definition of that and copy in similar types of code. So the prerequisite conditions and the Boolean. As well as the scriptable objects code. And it needs to accept a prerequisite condition to call back to. And let's see here. This is a dialog prerequisite, and we can subscribe. I think we can subscribe basically directly to the dialog, similarly to the way that the quest is done. So let's do that. So if we go to the definition of the dialog, we do the same thing here. We notify on dialog completed. So we will need to add an event into the dialog. And we'll call it on dialog completed. And we will call it here. When we turn in the dialog. And this is literally the only place that we're going to be calling it. For the dialog, we'll have to pass in this. And we will need to make this an iPrerequisite owner. So we'll add the iPrerequisite-owner interface. And that means that it actually needs to have a handle prerequisites met, or handle prerequisite updates. So we'll just right-click on this, Quick Actions and Refactoring, Implement Interface. And in this case, it will want to call back to its owner. Here we'll set prerequisite dialog dot on dialog completed plus equals handle dialog completed. And then we'll need to actually make the handle dialog completed, so public void handle dialog completed. And basically we just set prerequisite met is equal to true when that happens. And then here we just return prerequisite met. I think in the quest prerequisite down here, we should be unsubscribing not from System Event Manager, but from the actual quest. Okay, I think that's good. Now, this dialog is queried with this turned in. Let's see, so we set up the prerequisite conditions, handing set up scriptable objects. The dialog itself will need to make the callback to whatever owns it, which is from actually this my prerequisites met call, which is on the dialog interactable. And the dialog setup scriptable objects call interesting, nobody actually calls dialog.setup scriptable objects. Actually, that's fine though, because dialogs setup scriptable objects call is actually the describable resources setup scriptable objects call, so that's fine. So let's see, dialog still needs to make a call back to whoever owns it though. So let's see, in the same way that prerequisite conditions needs to have an iPrerequisite owner, we're going to need to do it slightly differently. In prerequisite conditions, we can actually accept the prerequisite owner in the setup scriptable objects call. The dialog is going to have to call back to its dialog interactable slightly differently. So the dialog let's see. The dialog is owned by the dialog interactable. So let's start with that. So multiple dialog interactables could potentially own the same dialog. And you would want to update basically all of them. So I think that means that dialog actually needs to have its own event then that it emits. And basically it does already. We just made that. We made the onDialog completed. But the dialog interactable actually doesn't need to know when the dialog is completed. Only in the sense of the prerequisites it does. Okay, so I don't think we need to do anything else there for now. All right, so then let's go to the next one. Which is going to be the faction disposition. Now, faction disposition is not a prerequisite in the sense that the other ones are. See, where every other prerequisite just calls the isMet method, which allows us to treat them in basically the same way. Faction disposition is not inheriting. Actually, I don't know. Are these things inheriting dialog prerequisite? They're implementing an I prerequisite. So I think what we need to do is we need to actually make a new class for this. Let's just look at a scriptable object that uses faction disposition for a minute. Or look at anything that uses faction disposition. There are, I believe, some quests that require faction disposition. Some of the characters as well, like Mix-a-Lot Unit. He requires faction in order for certain things to happen. So let's just go look at the way that that's implemented on him. There we go. So actually, interestingly enough, his faction disposition prerequisites are not showing up. Who else has them? Sneak-a-Lot Unit has some. There, right there. Okay. So for the faction disposition prerequisites, we have the faction name and the disposition. For every other type of prerequisite, it's just a prerequisite name. So that's fine, because we can still basically add an extra disposition field. Yeah, so we'll have to do that then. Just to make things consistent. So let's see. basically copy dialog prerequisite, so we'll look for the dialog prerequisite script, Control D to duplicate it. I'm going to call this faction prerequisite. And change the name right here to faction prerequisite. We'll still have the prerequisite name, but we're going to add a new field called disposition, and it's going to be an int. Just a second. Faction disposition. We don't allow decimals, I don't think, in that. Let's just confirm that. Oh, it is a float. Okay. So this will be a private float prerequisite disposition equals 0f by default. We're going to do, let's see, handle reputation updated, maybe. And let's figure out how we're going to get information on these reputation updates. I am going to add a new for each loop here. Prerequisite. For each faction prerequisite. And we'll need to make a new property here. And this is just going to be called faction prerequisites, and it will be a list of faction prerequisite, and that's a new list of faction prerequisite. So in this setup scriptable objects call, we basically want to send in this as well to get rid of these messages. And this is in faction prerequisites. We're not going to bother checking the faction disposition prerequisites anymore. And this new one should be in faction prerequisites. And the check result will simply be faction prerequisite.isMet, the way that everything else is done. this should say faction prerequisite. Okay, then we can go into the faction prerequisite code and we can basically perform this check right here. And if check result, then prerequisites met is true. And then handle the prerequisite updates, informing everybody. And else, we should actually set it to false, because although you can't lose faction disposition in the game yet, I'm not ruling out adding that in the future. Then what we need to do is, for the prerequisite name, we need to get a reference to the actual faction. So this will be a private faction prerequisite faction. And if the prerequisite name, then prerequisite faction equals system faction manager.myInstance.get resource based on the prerequisite name. And here we want to check prerequisite faction, and we want to check the prerequisite disposition. Alright, now we just have to figure out what we're going to subscribe to on the faction update. And I think we already have an event in the system event manager that handles that. I believe on reputation change. Let's find all references to that. It's called on notify on reputation change. We're going to remove the on prerequisites updated call from there. And let's see who subscribes to it, or who notifies, basically. Okay, so our player faction manager does whenever we add or set reputation. Whenever we apply a status effect modifier or remove a status effect modifier that has reputation. then we do it here as sort of a hack. And the hack is basically because we're toggling on and off the player faction on the nameplate. So I think for now I'm just going to subscribe to the System Event Manager version of this. Actually, let's see. Like, I'd really like to subscribe to the actual faction itself, but we can't really do that in this case. So yeah, for now I'm just going to subscribe to the System Event Manager version of this. It's not completely ideal, but it's way better than just subscribing to a generic notification, as these faction checks are actually really expensive because people can have different factions with different characters compared to the defaults. So yeah, let's just subscribe to the System Event Manager. And we'll subscribe to on reputation change. And we'll just call that handle reputation change. Okay, so now we have faction prerequisites. Okay, so now basically let's see. Previously, we used to be able to subscribe to on prerequisites updated. Let's find all references to that. And just basically try to get rid of them. Let's find who's calling notify on prerequisites updated. Now we're calling it on class specialization changes. However, I feel like it's not needed there because we actually don't have class specializations as a prerequisite. We've got faction dispositions, dialogue completion, quest status, abilities, trade skills, class prerequisites, but not class specializations as prerequisites. So we can just comment that out. For change character class, if we go to the definition of that, we already notify on class change right there. So we don't really need to send that call out right there either. When we set character class, we just call change character class, which calls set character class. Okay, just a second. Set character class on line 209. Oh, set player character class, right? Okay, good. So basically, we don't need it there because it's already called out further down the stack anyway. All right, let's see where else we're doing this here. We're doing it on set player class specialization. Interesting, because we already were notifying on the change class, which does the set class specialization anyway, which we don't really need to notify on because class specializations are not a prerequisite for anything. Now finally we have set player faction. Now this is, I believe, where we will actually want to emit an event. And we're gonna just notify on reputation change there. Okay, good. So now all generic notify on prerequisites updated methods are gone. And let's just get rid of them for good. Because we don't want to accidentally call any of those anymore. We always want the most specific method possible to be called. So that means we're actually going to get rid of notify on prerequisites updated. And then we're going to go up to the top of this file and get rid of on prerequisites updated as well. But first, let's find all references to that and see who's calling it. So on prerequisites updated is being called in the unit spawn node. So this is basically where we need to tell our prerequisites to initialize themselves with us basically as the caller. the iPrerequisite owner. So I believe what we want to do is we want to now implement iPrerequisite owner. An iPrerequisite owner let's see. Checks his prerequisites. And he should actually be running a handle prerequisite updates method instead. And when he sets up his prerequisite conditions, he needs to pass in this. So we have this check prerequisites right here, which does what it's supposed to. So now what we want to do basically is make a public void handle prerequisite updates and just call check prerequisites. Handle prerequisite updates will satisfy our iPrerequisite owner. And now we can unsubscribe from that system event manager event. Because the individual prerequisites that we own will tell us if they're met and force that check so that we're not handling prerequisite updates that we don't need to. All right, next up, spawnable class has prerequisites as well. So spawnable needs to also be an iPrerequisite owner. And we can send in this into those scriptable objects. And then this one also needs a handle prerequisite updates. Which it already has. Great. And all we need to do is basically just unsubscribe from the handle prerequisite updates method. Okay, that looks good. And interesting, interaction panel UI. Interaction panel UI subscribes to prerequisite updates. Let's see how we want to handle this. The interaction panel UI, the reason that it subscribes to prerequisite updates is if I have the interaction panel open and I turn in a quest, I want the interaction panel to refresh itself, basically. And the interaction panel doesn't just handle quests, it handles it like everything, like dialogues and all sorts of other stuff. So we still need a way to inform the interaction panel that it should refresh itself. But I think we want to do that by actually linking back to the interactable that the interaction panel is displaying items for at this particular moment. So to do that, let's go to the check prerequisites method. This one doesn't need to be an iPrerequisite owner because it doesn't actually have prerequisites or scriptable objects to set up. But what we should do is make a way so that the interactable can tell this thing that it needs to check its prerequisites. So we'll find the code where we actually set the interactable. We may do that through my interactable. Show interactables. Okay. Let's see if this is the only place that we call that. We also receive a window close notification, at which point we can clear the interactable. Okay, and let's see if we find all references to my interactable. We also do set it when we open the interaction window. So what we'll need to do is basically on the set method, we will want to subscribe as well. So let's change the way that this code is structured a little bit here. Okay. So if interactable does not equal null, then what we want to do is interactable dot, and our interactable needs to emit a method. So let's see, we'll call it on prerequisite updates, I guess. And then we can omit it when our handle prerequisite updates is called. So we'll do on prerequisite updates. And then our interaction panel UI can subscribe to it. So if it's not null, then on prerequisite updates minus equals and we don't have handle prerequisite updates here. We just have check prerequisites, I think. Yeah. So let's make a public void handle prerequisite updates. And it's just going to be a wrapper for check prerequisites just to keep naming consistent. So this will be handle prerequisite updates. And then set the interactable to the value. And then if the interactable does not equal null, then we will want to subscribe to those prerequisite updates. And then let's see, wherever else we have that interactable, like when we set the interactable, we'll want to do the same thing. And basically, since that's pretty much already done inside of that public method, why don't we just make this myInteractable equals interactable? And here, same thing, myInteractable equals null. Alright, so that should basically deal with the subscription and unsubscription to the interactable, allowing it to pass back its prerequisite update check. Okay, so I think what we need to do now is go back to the System Event Manager and go back to where we started and try to find all references to this on prerequisites updated. Good. So here we can now remove that from the subscriptions. And now nobody is referring to on prerequisites updated. Great, so everyone should now be referring to some sort of event that is very specific to whatever's happening, and I think that will actually solve a good majority of the event spam. I mean, in the future, I'd like to tweak this a little bit more, like with the dialogues and such, to be subscribing to proper dialogues. So let's see, behavior profile has prerequisites, so I guess we need to pass this in. And behavior profile then needs to be an I prerequisite owner. Which means it has to have a handle prerequisite updates method. And we actually want this to call back to its owner, which is going to be a behavior interactable. So let's find all references to the behavior profile here. Actually, you know what would be even better? We just need to find out who calls this behavior profile setup scriptable objects. So this is called from the system behavior profile manager. And it's called when we get the behavior profile. This means that we don't have like a calling parent object to send back into this thing. So what we should do then is find the behavior interactable that references these. So let's find all references to that get new resource, and this is where it happens right here. Then what we'll want to do is basically I think actually we'll add a callback on this, because once again, multiple behavior interactables could potentially have a reference to the same behavior profile. So our behavior profile will need an event similarly to the way that what was the last thing we added the event to the way that interactable needs it. So we'll take behavior profile, we will add an on prerequisite updates event. In the behavior interactable, we'll basically need to subscribe to that. So we'll want to subscribe to it by doing handle prerequisite updates. And since this is an interactable option, and interactable options are already calling back to their interactable, it should be okay to just do that. So we want tmp behavior profile dot on prerequisite updates plus equals handle prerequisite updates. Okay, let's save that. Get rid of those brackets because they're not needed. Then check what other errors we have here. So loot has prerequisite conditions as well. Loot is a little bit different. We only need to check the prerequisite conditions on loot at drop time. We don't actually need to call back to it at all. It's checked basically dynamically. Either way though, loot's still going to have to be an iPrerequisite owner. Which means it's going to have implement interface for the handle prerequisite updates. And I don't think it needs to actually do anything. Because basically this is checked at the minute that the thing drops. Which is totally fine. So that's good. We don't have to worry about that. Finally, there's one more error here. Okay. So a quest has prerequisites. Which means that the quest needs to also be an iPrerequisite owner. And we'll want to refactor that and implement the interface. And do we need to do anything about this? Let's see. When a quest's prerequisite conditions are met, it becomes available. So essentially that means that any quest giver who has a copy of this quest should be able to receive a notification that this quest has been had its status updated. Now the great thing is we've already got the action here for on quest status updated. So when we receive handle prerequisite updates, basically we should just need to do on quest status updated. Finally, I believe we want to make sure that all quest giver interactables actually subscribe to this. So if we find all references to on quest status updated, we can see that it's done in quest prerequisites, but we will want to make sure that it's also done in the quest giver interactable. So let's find our quest giver interactable. Just let this thing compile here. Serialization hierarchy. Okay, I have to fix this because apparently I made a repeating loop inside of level prerequisites down to prerequisite conditions. Wow, that's neat. All right. Anyway, back to quest giver. So I want my quest giver. My quest giver has quests. Which we add right here. We'll also want to subscribe to them. We have a handle prerequisite updates, so that's perfect. So now what we want to do is basically quest node dot my quest dot on quest status updated plus equals handle prerequisite updates. Now let's figure out what we did wrong with level prerequisite, because level prerequisite shouldn't have prerequisite conditions. Interesting, okay. I'm not sure why that's a serialization error specifically, as this is a private property. So maybe we should just add like a callback here instead to get rid of this serialization warning. So what I'll do then is just on status updated, basically. We won't bother setting that because we don't need this. And basically we'll just call on status updated right here and get rid of that. Then in prerequisite conditions where we initialize the level prerequisite, we will also want to subscribe to that. and we will subscribe to it with handle prerequisite updates. And we'll want to add that event then to the iPrerequisite interface. And then basically for every type of prerequisite, we'll want to do that. And that means that realistically we don't even have to accept those anymore. Okay, that should cause a bunch of errors, I think. As these no longer match up. And so we'll just be calling these onStatusUpdated events instead. Getting rid of this prerequisite condition so we don't create that weird serialization loop. And then continuing to do that for the rest of these. And 4 more. Oh, faction prerequisite already has this. We just need to get rid of that. that so this matches the interface I prerequisite. Okay, and then we no longer need to pass that in because we'll be subscribing to events instead. So prerequisite.on status updated plus equals handle prerequisite updates. We'll want to do that for each of these. Let that compile. Okay, now I think, good, I can clear all that stuff. And we don't have a serialization error anymore. And actually, in fact, we have 0 errors anymore. I think it's actually time to test this. So let's press play. And see if we get any errors. I still have to write some code for unsubscribing to some of those events. And I'll set that up in a little bit, but I think I can possibly at least load a single level and test the sword thing that I wanted to test out. Potentially. If Unity doesn't crash. Okay, so the only time I've seen Unity crash like that in the past is when there was an overloaded method call where the compiler couldn't distinguish between which one of those overloads it should be calling, as I think there was like an equal chance of calling either of them. So I think what I'm going to do, as that'll probably take a good deal of debugging to figure out exactly which of those overloads, due to the fact that Unity just crashes without giving you any error messages, it's a lot harder to determine where that's happening in your code without writing like a whole pile of breakpoints and stuff to like basically halt the editor and then figure out which line of code is crashing it. That's a little bit of a long and laborious process, and because this episode's already going on 2.5 hours, I'm going to say for the most part we've finished the restructuring. We're not using the central event manager basically to do generic updates anymore. We're updating or subscribing to updates specifically for the thing that we care about, which should reduce the number of calls. I'm going to go fix whatever this crash issue is, and then I'll come back in the next episode. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was a little long, but you know, that's game development behind the scenes. Sometimes you just got to spend a long time refactoring your code to improve performance. So if you did enjoy that, please don't forget to thumbs up the video, subscribe to the AnyRPG YouTube channel, or just leave a note in the comments. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.